Thanks to the organizers of this meeting for inviting me here. I'm always pleased to speak to an audience in Surrey because I know that many of you have been involved in the struggles for social justice, human liberation, for socialism, for peace, all of your lives. So it's always an honor to speak to people like that. I want to begin by thanking another group of people, the First Nations on whose lands we are meeting here today, the Coast Salish peoples who welcomed settlers and immigrants to this beautiful territory, this beautiful corner of the world, so graciously, despite the way they were treated by the colonizers, the imperialists. We always extend our thanks and our respect to the Coast Salish peoples for allowing us to share this beautiful place with us. When I was asked to talk about this topic today, of course, Darshan S Canadian is someone who's very familiar to people from my party, to the readers of the newspaper that I publish, People's Voice, going back many years. And we always, when we talk about heroes and martyrs of our movement, we are very conscious that people can be heroes in many different ways. Some through the selfless, quiet, regular contributions, the people that organize meetings, cook the food, distribute our newspapers, do all of the jobs that are necessary to hold any movement together. These people are heroes as much as anybody in our movement. And their names are usually known only in their local area to their friends and comrades. And there are other types of heroes, and some of them known in more than one country. One of those from our party is Norman Bethune, who of course is probably the most famous Canadian in China, and is also very well known in Canada as the great revolutionary communist doctor who made many advances in medical science, struggles for universal Medicare and so forth. Darshan S Canadian is on that same level, a hero who is known widely in two countries for his contributions to the struggle for social justice, for socialism, in different ways on two different continents. He came to this country as a young man looking for a better life, just as many of our ancestors did. I had ancestors that arrived here from places as far apart as Norway, and the Breton region of France, Ireland. Some of them, ironically, ended up taking over the land of some of my other ancestors, the Métis people of the southern prairies. It's one of the ironies of imperialism. You get groups of working people from different backgrounds, different sides of the world, struggling to survive, sometimes thrown together in circumstances which can lead to conflict and misunderstandings and problems. One of the great lies of Canadian history, one of the things that's usually covered up, but it's colored Canadian history and stained Canadian history for over 100 years, is the lie that this is supposed to be a white man's country. A shameful doctrine that the colonizers used to try and control who came here, who had the right to live on these lands that were stolen from the First Nations. It was okay to invite some of them to do the heavy lifting, to build the railway. Hundreds of them killed, Chinese laborers building the railway through the mountains. Others giving their blood and sweat and tears to chop down the forests to build the cities that we live in, including many from South Asia. But when it came to giving them the right to vote, the right to bring their relatives, etc., well, we all know that story. In the name of that doctrine of a white man's country. Well, it was a lie. It was fought. When Darshan came here, it had been a struggle against that doctrine for many years. He didn't arrive to a blank slate, as it were. He came to a country where there were many anti-racists who were active. He came to a country where the Gadar Party had already had a great effect upon the South Asian community and even more widely. He came to a country where there were strong revolutionary currents already developing, including in the city of Vancouver, one of the jewels of the British Empire, When he went to the University of BC, became a student, one of the first things that happened was he met communists, some who were quite famous in the history of our province, people like Emil Bjarnason. And he quickly became drawn into that movement, but he also had to make a living, he had to survive. As you know, he went to work in the forestry industry in Alberta, which was actually where he joined the Communist Party. And at some point, during those first couple of years after he arrived here, he was asked by the Communist Party and the labor organizers for the party to take on a very important assignment. And that was to help build the International Woodworkers of America, which was an international union, Canadian and US based. It was actually the only international union in the history of this continent where the leadership was mostly people who lived in Canada, not the United States. Harold Pritchett was the president. Some of you know the name Harold Pritchett. And the people who spoke to Darshan explained that to build the union, they needed to recruit not just the white workers, they needed the South Asian workers, they needed the Chinese workers, and they had to have organizers who were capable, who knew the industry, who were able to go amongst all different types of workers in that union and get them to sign union cards. Not an easy thing to do, but a point in history when being a labor organizer meant that you had a target painted on your back for the bosses to attack you. You had to be very smart, very careful. So they signed up Darshan to recruit among the South Asians, and Roy Ma, who signed up thousands of Chinese workers and made the IAPI into a much larger, much more powerful union, which benefited all the workers in that union, white, South Asian, Chinese, everybody. And it benefited the entire working class of this province, in this country. It made a tremendous contribution to building one of the most powerful militant unions, had the biggest impacts on the politics, the economics of the West Coast. This was one of the unions that made the first breakthroughs in getting the 8-hour day. Think about it. Up until that time, the mid-1940s, it was very rare for any group of workers in this country to be able to, punch their clock and go home after 8 hours of labor, be with their family, get involved in community activities, be involved in their political organizations. Up until then, they had to slave 9, 10, 12 hours, depending, which industry, which period of time we're talking about. So these brothers made a huge contribution to the entire working class of this country. At a time when, in the case of Darshan and Roy Ma, they didn't have the right to vote. They began leading big campaigns to change that. Campaigns that were ultimately successful. Here, Canada was involved in a war against fascism. Darshan had volunteered to fight in that war, but they would not allow him to vote, even if he was in the armed forces. They said, well, I'll go organize workers instead. That was his contribution to the struggle against fascism. But here we were, fighting against Hitler, who had crushed the labor movement, crushed all democratic rights in the parts of Europe where the Nazis held sway. Back here at home, huge numbers of people, because of the color of their skin, their country of origin, etc., indigenous peoples, they did not have the right to vote here, or other basic, simple democratic rights. First Nations people didn't even have the right to hire a lawyer. If you lived on a reserve, you could not meet in groups larger than 3. If you wanted to go off the reserve to do something, go into town to buy some food, go to another reserve to visit relatives, you had to get the permission of the Indian agent. All of these kinds of petty restrictions, racist laws that impacted the people of this country, the people who worked the hardest to build this country. Utterly shameful situation. So Darshan and the others, his brothers, his comrades, led these campaigns. They were successful. It took until 2 or 3 years after the end of the war, but it did succeed. And Darshan, in the period of that time, 1937 up to the end of the war, through his organizing abilities, through his educational work among his community, he became very highly regarded by the revolutionary period of that movement. The Labour Progressive Party, I think one of the speakers earlier referred to the LPP as the Communist Party was known, starting in 1943. Why? Because this was the last country among all of the anti-fascist alliance that fought Hitler. It was the last country to unban the communists. It had been banned at the start of the most consistent anti-fascists leaders were in jail. The leaders of many of the ethnic groups led by the communists were in jail. So finally they had to say, well, okay, you won't allow a communist party in this country, we'll start the Labour Progressive Party. And Darshan was one of the people who helped build that among the South Asian workers. And to show you the esteem in which Darshan was held, I brought a book here that's in the library at the Center for Socialist Education where I work. It's a book by Maurice Thorez, who was a leader of the French Communist Party. It's called Son of the People. And the book is irrelevant to the anecdote. It was given as a gift to Sam English, who was one of the party workers in BC at the time, to thank him for his work for a party school. And it was signed by the BC Yukon Committee of the Labour Progressive Party, which had in the range of about 5,000–6,000 members at that point in time. Signed by the leaders and the entire provincial committee. Nigel Morgan's name's here, Maurice Rush, some of you know these names, all the rest of them. You look down through the names, there's Darshan Singh, who at the time would have been about 28 years old. Roy Ma's name is there. I know most of these names and, somewhat of their contributions to the working class movement in British Columbia. They were likely two of the youngest people on that provincial committee, which showed the importance of their work and the esteem to which they were held. It's quite a remarkable set of signatures. If anybody wants to look at it later, you can. He went back to India not long after that, as you all know. These were tumultuous times. The working class movement was on a steep up curve everywhere around the world, including in Canada. These were years of huge strikes, not only among the woodworkers, but many other industries in Canada. Big gains by the working class, forcing concessions from the governments of the day. It was a very powerful left, not just the communists. The CCF was also part of that, and other left forces. The early struggles for Medicare were building up, for higher minimum wages, for old age pensions, for all of the things that we regard as so essential today to our lives. Darshan, for his reasons, decided he wanted to go back to India, which was on the cusp of independence, and make his contribution to the struggle for socialism in that country. And I'm not as familiar with his work there as I am with what he contributed here, but we all know he went back to Punjab, to his village of Langari, and worked for many, many years, nearly 40 years, in the day-to-day hard struggle to improve the living and working conditions of the place where he came from. And any of you who's been involved in the labor movement, community fights in Surrey, wherever, you know that this is painstaking, difficult work, reaching out to people one at a time, building larger movements, consistently taking on the ruling classes, their local representatives, and also the people at the center of power. Nothing easy about this work. And this is one of the definitions of heroism. Starting at the base, building a movement that will create the conditions to eventually liberate the entire working class, to liberate workers of all countries from capitalism, from exploitation, from war, poverty. It can't be done just with a couple of nice speeches at the front of a room. It has to be done amongst the people themselves. You have to be able to connect with those people. You have to live as those people do. Simply, not in a grand style. Darshan was one of those who could do that. He was one of those who would never ask other people to do what he wouldn't do himself. If that meant riding his bicycle however many kilometers to speak at an event, go to a meeting, he would happily do it. If that meant working very hard right in his own home, his own village, he would do that too. That's the essence of what being a revolutionary means. He was one of those, he had his loyalties to his party, his responsibilities, but he was not someone who looked down upon other political trends in the working class and people's movements when they suffered oppression at the hands of the authorities, as they often do. In India still today, and Canada still today, and in that time, he was one of those who spoke out against it, regardless of what party or what affiliation they had. This is something that's also important for revolutionaries. No matter how much we may disagree about certain things, we have to stand up for each other. We have to stand together, or we'll be crushed. He was one of those who spoke out against the kinds of communalism and fundamentalism that are not just a feature of life in India. Sometimes we are told, well, that's, that backward country over there. No, this is something that happens all around the world. Those of us that come from mostly European backgrounds are very aware. Our ancestors went to sack Jerusalem. Why? Well, because the Pope said so, because we wanted to uphold our version of the Bible compared to somebody else's version of their good book. There's nothing particular about one country or another. This evil of communalism, pitting people against each other on the basis of their religion or their caste, their color. Darshan spoke out against that as part of his political work in India. We all know very well. That's why he was assassinated, because he was a particularly effective spokesperson against that kind of backward thinking. And we also all know that it was a very complicated period, that some of those who claimed to speak on behalf of secularism weren't consistent about it, shall we say, or abandoned those positions when it was opportune to do so. But Darshan was one who was always very principled in his approach to these matters. He was always one who stood with the working class and with the peasants, with the poor people, no matter what the issue was. It's very easy if you get involved in politics. There will always be those who will tempt you. Help us with this project. Help us to, do this or that, which if you look into it will mean benefiting those with the money, those with the power more than anybody else, and will help you get reelected. We're all familiar with those kinds of stories. Darshan was not one of those to fall for that kind of thing. There are many other things that could be said about Darshan S Canadian. And a lot of it is in the book, of course, that Harjeet Dodria edited, and I hope all of you already have this. If you don't, you can get a copy at the back. A remarkable collection of articles by people who knew Darshan best, who worked with him very closely. It's an irreplaceable piece of Canadian history and Indian history. There's not enough of that kind of thing in this country. Some of it is in other sources, the pages of the Pacific Tribune, which is the predecessor of People's Voice, of which I'm the editor. I brought a couple of volumes of the paper, bound volumes. You can see, for example, a 1979 issue of the paper where Darshan was speaking to the editor, Sean Griffin. It was a full page about his life, his struggles, the big issues going on in India. And we always do our best, in our publications to make sure that the full experience of the working class in this country is reflected. We don't always do it as well as we should, but we try. The latest issue of Rebel Youth, for example. This is the magazine of the Young Communist League here. There's copies at the back if anybody would like one. YCL LJC is the League, the Jeunesse Communiste Heroes. We walk in their footsteps. It's a tribute to Darshan to Jean Corbin, Maurice Rush, because we want the young people of this country who are becoming involved in the revolutionary movement to know their traditions, to know their history, to know the facts of how we came to have a reasonable standard of life in this country, and who fought for those things, what they stood for, where they came from. If you don't know your past, you can't find your way to the future. So it's our role at this time, when hundreds of young people are becoming involved in the YCL across the country, to ensure that that they know who came before them, including a young man like Darshan, who was, when he came to this country, he was younger than many of the people who were at our center yesterday, having a day-long seminar on the struggle for free post-secondary education. He probably could have taught most of them something and learned something from them as well. I think I'm going to wind up now. I think I've said enough. Once again, it's been such an honor to be here to talk about this remarkable man who had such an impact on the history of two countries. We intend to do more over the coming period of time to keep Darshan's memory alive as one of the great heroes of the revolutionary movement in this country. And I hope that there will be other events put on by other organizations as well. We will pay tribute to Darshan as part of an event we're planning for November of next year. The main theme of that will be the 100th anniversary of the death of Norman Bethune. We'll have participation from China, but we also want to honor Darshan at that particular event as one of the great heroes of our movement in this country over the last century. So, thank you very much again for inviting me.
Anytime.